Well, hello and welcome to the Rooted Together podcast, the podcast which aims to root you in Christ through His Word together. I'm your host, Charles, and today we are in Genesis chapter 4 as we continue our series on Genesis, the beginning, the King, and His people. And as we look at chapter 4, we want to ask the question, where is the grace of God in Genesis chapter 4? It's the famous story of Cain and Abel. And if you're remembering that from your childhood, you're thinking, wow, that story didn't have a lot of grace. A brother kills a brother and he's thrown out of the land, the area. And we need to pump the brakes and stop and look and say, where is the grace of God on display in the text? Because what we discover as we read through Genesis chapter 4 is that God, His grace is on full display. And that often gets overlooked in our reading of Genesis because we're often reading it for the minute details. For example, we might be curious to ask the question like, well, wait a minute, Cain had a wife. Where did she come from? And I understand that. That's certainly a fascinating question. Here's the thing. The Bible has no desire to answer that question. It's not the point of the text. Moses is not writing the story of Cain and Abel so that you can go, oh, that's where Cain's wife came from. That it's a minute detail that Moses wasn't interested in explaining or exploring. But what he was interested in doing was telling his people, Israel, on the edge of the promised land, overlooking the Jordan River, seeing into the land that God had promised their great-great-grandfather Abraham, and tell them that God is a gracious God, but He does respond to sin. And of course, they knew that. They had been the recipients of that response for the last 40 years. And so as we jump into that story, let's look past the minute details, such as where did Cain's wife come from? Well, she's there. Instead, let's see the grace of God fully on display in the text. Well, first I want you to notice that God is still talking with Adam and Eve. Remember, we last left them being kicked out of the garden, fully aware of the shame of their sin. And now we have God talking to their offspring, Cain and Abel. And we don't want to look past that. The fact that God is still talking to them is important. And the fact that God not only is talking to them, but He is accepting acts of worship and sacrifice. Like the offerings they brought were an act of worship before God, and God is active in that situation. In fact, so much so that when we get to verse 6, we see that Cain's sacrifice had been rejected by God, and yet God wasn't through with Cain. That He told Cain, why are you angry? Do what's right. Give me a good offering and I will accept it, but be careful. There's a warning, and that warning is important because what we see here is we see God's grace on display through His just simple communication with Cain. He's communicating with Cain. He's talking with him. He's instructing him about what he should do and that he must be careful. There's a dire warning on display here in verse 7. So as we look at God's grace to Cain, we see that if you do what is right, God says, won't you be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. And we wonder, okay, why is God telling Cain this? Because He is warning Cain that you are angry. I'm instructing you. Bring me another sacrifice. God didn't say, nope, it's all over. He says, go and bring another sacrifice. If you do what is right, then it'll be accepted. But if you do not do what is right and you continue down this path, there is an enemy, and it is crouching, and its desire is for you. Its desire is to rule over you, and you must rule over it because God knows that Cain's heart is starting to go to bad places, and God, through His grace, this is step one of that grace, is calling out to Cain, no, return to me. Do what is right in my sight. Don't don't be unaware that there is an enemy that is seeking to rule over you, and it's going to lead you down places you don't want to go. Well, he goes there. In verse 8, Cain puts together a plan to kill his brother. And as you follow the text, he basically does. He kills him. He tricks him, and then he kills him. And then step 2 of God's grace to Cain. God shows up, and he communicates with Cain. Now, God knows what Cain did, a lot like Adam and Eve when God came into the garden and said, Adam, Eve, where are you? He does something very similar. He meets Cain. That's an act of grace. God could have come in righteous anger and judgment, but instead meets with him and talks with him and engages him in conversation. Where is your brother, Cain? And to which Cain, very much like his father Adam, answers, I don't know. Am I my brother's guardian or his keeper? And then God says, okay, you're not going to confess it to me. You're not going to admit you're wrong. So what he does, he says, what have you done? Because I can hear your brother's blood crying out to me. I know for sure that you've killed your brother. And so now, he says in verse 11, you were cursed and alienated from the ground that opened up its mouth to receive your brother's blood that you, Cain, have shed. And if you work the ground, it will never again give you its yield. You will be restless and a wanderer on the earth. First of all, let's stop and think, Cain killed his brother. There is grace in the fact that God did not eliminate Cain. God did not respond to Cain's murder with Cain's blood. He did not demand that Cain also die. Instead, he offers him life. But it can't be life like it was before. It can't be like he didn't just kill his brother, like nothing happened. God's grace to Cain is that he lets him live, but does say there is a judgment for sin. He must now wander the earth. Now, what's interesting is Cain's reaction in verse 13. Just notice this. Keep in mind that Cain has just murdered his brother in cold blood because his sacrifice was accepted and not Cain's. And God doles out punishment that most of us would admit was almost scandalously too merciful. And Cain's response is, my punishment is too great to bear. He deserved death, and yet his life that he had been given to wander freely, mind you, just out of the land, and to have some difficulty with tilling the land. He says, no, that punishment is too great. Since you are banishing me today from the face of the earth, I must hide from your presence and become a restless wanderer on the earth. Notice he never said that Cain must hide from the presence of God, but I think it's Cain realizing that sin and God's light just can't coexist. But he says, whoever finds me will kill me. Well, it's ironic because he had no mercy in killing his brother, but now he's worried that he'll be killed by other people. There's a little bit of irony in that statement. And then God, in his graciousness and grace and mercy upon mercy, says, well, in that case, whoever kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over, which he then places a mark on Cain and says, basically, if anyone kills you, it'll bring 7-fold, and they'll know that by this mark I'm placing on you. So, Cain, don't worry about other people trying to kill you, even though you murdered your brother and didn't seem all that bothered by it. And I graciously let you go, and you complained, and I will graciously put a mark on you. And this is his grace upon grace upon grace. And then Cain's response, again, after murdering his brother, complaining that the punishment's too much, even though it was way too lenient. In some sense, it was very lenient. He's complaining that it's too much. God then gives more protection to Cain, who murdered his brother. And he leaves the presence of God to the land of Nod, east of Eden, the east being further away from God's presence. And then he has a son, and then he builds a city, and he names it after not God, who was gracious to him, who gave him life, who allows him to live and breathe even now, or not now, but even then in the story. And then he names that city after his son, which is basically saying, thanks, God, but no thanks. And we see that even though God is gracious, Cain again and again throws that grace in God's face, and yet God's grace extends to him in allowing him to live, allowing him to leave, allowing him to have a wife, to have a son, to build a city, and to have a name. Because we see that what begins to happen here is we have this chronology, genealogy that goes from there, the line of Cain. He has a son, and you have all these different names. And then you get to Lamech, and by the way, Lamech has 2 wives. Notice as they get further away from God's design, you have a man that has 2 wives, and he sings a song about killing a man because that man was nice to him or insulted him, and so he killed him. And he sings a song about it, or he at least hurt the man. We don't really know. The language is a little unclear between injure and kill, but we have Lamech through Cain's line bragging about hurting a man and saying, hey, if Cain would be avenged 7 times over, if someone killed him, I'm going to be 27 times. Like, God's going to doubly protect me. No, he won't. Or no, he shouldn't. Like, the idea is, like, he's taking advantage of the grace of God. And what we see through Moses is saying here to his people is the line of Cain is so corrupt that you get people throwing the grace of God back in his face and singing about hurting somebody, singing about breaking that order. And therefore you would ask, how can this line bring about the promise in Genesis 3:15? Well, God's answer in verse 25 through Moses' writing is it cannot. And Adam was intimate with his wife again, so we have to restart here. And she gave birth to a son named Seth. And for God said, God has given me another offspring in place of Abel, since Cain killed him, and a son was born to Seth also. We have another line, and what we'll find is that line will lead eventually to Noah. So what we do is we have the line of Cain, and God is gracious to him, and yet Cain repeatedly denies the grace of God and makes it cheap. Therefore, his line will not and cannot bring about the promise in Genesis 3:15 for God to bring someone who will kill the curse of sin. And so what begins to change is there's a new line, the line of Seth. Now, they won't be perfect. We know this. But they at least are starting on the right path, a new start, because the line of Cain will run out. So as we read this story, instead of focusing on the questions of like, where did the city come from? Where these people Cain was worried about come from? Which, we don't know. The Bible isn't interested in answering that question. But what we need to do is look at God being gracious to Cain, and we get from that this beautiful principle that God is gracious to sinners, because if he wasn't, there would be no salvation. There would be no cross, because the cross was the ultimate display of God's grace for his people. We know that God is gracious to sinners, even more than we can comprehend, even more than we can acknowledge sometimes. He will respond to sin, and he does. He responds to Cain's sin. There is punishment. He is left to wonder. There is punishment. His line is ultimately ended at the flood. So the question then becomes, will we respond to God's grace this week like Cain and throw it in God's face, or will we respond to God's graciousness in worship and adoration of him? Will we be ungracious to God who is grace-filled? Will we marvel at God's graciousness? Will we marvel at God's mercy this week? And maybe you need to examine your heart and see, where is it that I have been like Cain and have rejected the grace of God, complained about the grace of God? Where do I need to lean into that grace and that mercy? Where do I need to lean into worship when maybe I responded wrongly? Maybe you're enduring the punishment or the consequence of that sin. Lean into God, because he's gracious to forgive and gracious to restore, because where Cain's line ends, we get a new line that will lead to a cross, that will lead to God's ultimate grace for people, that will lead to Jesus being on that cross saying, Father, forgive them who kill me, for they don't know what they do, but you do. Well, we'll jump into Genesis chapter 5 and follow this line and this development next time, and I look forward to seeing you there.